All right, ready to put on your detective hat? Today, we're going to figure out why some problems seem to have a life of their own, and how you can become a master at finding the real culprit. Let's start the investigation.
You ever feel like you're playing whack-a-mole with a problem? You fix it, and then bam, it just pops right back up somewhere else. Why is that? Why do some problems just never seem to go away? It's a super frustrating mystery, but it's one we're about to solve.
Well, the secret is all about understanding this one critical difference. See, above the surface, you've got the symptom. That's the headache, the warning light on your dash, the obvious frustration. But way down below, hidden from view, is the root cause. That's the real reason the symptom exists in the first place. We spend so much of our time treating what we see on the surface, but a lasting solution? That only comes from digging deeper.
And that brings us to our first big rule for this investigation. You have to recognize that the problem you see, it's usually just a symptom. To really solve anything for good, we have to learn to look beyond the obvious clues.
Now, there's actually a professional framework for this, and it's called root cause analysis. Just think of it as our official playbook for the investigation. It's a systematic way of digging past those surface-level symptoms to find the fundamental reason a problem is happening. This is how we shift from just patching things up to actually permanently solving them.
So how do we start digging? Well, our first and maybe our most powerful tool is something called the 5 why interrogation. It's a brilliantly simple technique where you just keep asking why until the truth is finally forced out into the open.
Okay, so the interrogation starts with the very first why, and it always targets the most obvious symptom. Let's use a classic example. A customer is unhappy. We ask our first question, why? And the immediate answer is, their delivery was late. Okay, that's our starting clue.
Now we dig a little deeper. Why number 2? Why was the delivery late? The answer might be, because the product left the warehouse late. Okay, see? We've just peeled back the first layer of the onion, moving from what the customer saw to an internal cause.
On to our third why. So why did the package leave the warehouse late? Let's say the answer is because the items weren't packaged in time. Now this is where it gets interesting, right? We're moving beyond simple excuses and starting to poke at the actual process.
You see the pattern here? On to why number 4. Why weren't the items packaged in time? Because we ran out of packaging materials. Now that is a huge clue. This fourth why often uncovers a systemic or a process-related issue. It wasn't one person's fault, the system itself failed.
And that leads us to the final question, the big one. Why number 5? Why did the packaging materials run out? Because our inventory system doesn't automatically reorder supplies. And boom, there it is. This final why almost always reveals the foundational, the true root cause.
And just like that, after a quick 5-step interrogation, the root cause is identified. You see, the problem was never the late delivery. That was just the last in a chain of symptoms. The real problem was a broken inventory process. You fix that, and you solve the problem for good. Case closed. On this lead, anyway.
The 5 whys gave us a prime suspect, for sure. But a good detective never stops at the first confession. We need to consider all the possibilities. So that brings us to our next step, lining up all the usual suspects by investigating every possible cause category.
The key here is to think broadly and avoid getting tunnel vision. Could the root cause be people-related? Maybe a training issue? Or a process flaw, like the one we just found? Could it be a failure in technology? Or maybe it's something external, like a market or customer factor. What about an internal policy or even a broader environmental issue? Looking at all these angles, make sure you don't chase the wrong culprit.
Okay, once you've lined up your suspects, you can't just go on a hunch. It's time for our next step, finding the smoking gun. This is all about gathering cold, hard evidence to build your case.
Honestly, your strongest evidence is almost always going to be data. A chart like this can be incredibly powerful. Just imagine, this shows a huge spike in late deliveries every single time inventory for a certain material drops below a threshold. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. That is hard evidence.
But numbers don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes qualitative evidence, like this direct quote from a user, is the absolute missing piece of the puzzle. Hearing someone say, "This feature is just too confusing, I gave up after 2 clicks," that gives you the powerful why behind the data. It's the human story that brings the investigation to life.
And finally, a great detective always zooms out. Is this problem something unique to you, or is it bigger? Industry research helps you check your findings against what's happening out in the wider world.
If everyone in your field is struggling with the same thing, it might suggest the root cause is a larger, external force, not just a simple mistake you made internally.
Okay, so you've interrogated the problem, you've lined up your suspects, and you've gathered the evidence. You are confident you've found the culprit. But before you go and close the case, there's one last critical step: validation. This makes sure you're about to solve the right problem. You have to stop and ask yourself this very simple but really profound question. Is the cause I identified truly the thing that's driving this problem? Because if you're wrong, any fix you put in place is just going to be a complete waste of time and money.
So how do you validate it? Well, you run a small test. First, you create a clear, testable hypothesis. Something like, if we implement an auto-order system for packaging, then late deliveries from stockouts will drop by 90%. Then, you design a small, low-cost pilot test, maybe just for one product line. If the test works, you've confirmed your root cause, and now you can confidently roll out the full solution.
And that right there is the complete detective's mindset. It's a clear, repeatable process. First, always look past the obvious symptoms. Second, interrogate the problem with the 5 whys. Third, line up all your suspects and gather hard evidence. And finally, always validate your conclusion before you declare the case closed.
So I'll leave you with this one final thought. What's a recurring symptom in your world, at work, at home, anywhere, that deserves a real investigation? Now you have the tools. It's time to stop just treating symptoms and start truly solving problems.